Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, good morning, and you're all very welcome to this conversation with Professor David Little. I'm Breffni O'Rourke. I'm the head of the Centre for Language and Communication Studies, CLCS, which, as many of you will know, was founded by David Little in 1979. So it's a particular honour and a real pleasure for me to introduce him this morning. As you also know, later today, David will be conferred with an honorary doctorate alongside our colleague who's here, Corinna Salvadori Lonergan, Ida Sagarra, and Hans Christian Oeser, in a ceremony marking the 250th anniversary of the establishment of modern languages in Trinity College. It's a fitting way for Trinity to recognise David's immense contribution to language education, not only here in the university, but nationally and internationally. From the beginning, David's vision for CLCS was of a place where research and practice in language teaching would actively inform one another. And that interplay between theory and practice has really been a constant throughout his career. His work on language learner autonomy in particular has been a thread running through all his work and has been hugely influential, not just in defining and theorizing the concept, but in working through what it actually means for teaching in a wide range of contexts. In the context of Trinity, initiatives like the Language and Culture electives and the Centre for English Language Learning and Teaching grew out of his energy and leadership. But his impact goes far beyond that. At national level, he has led pioneering work in areas such as refugee language education, linguistic diversity in schools, and deaf education, including the promotion of Irish Sign Language. Our own thriving Centre for Deaf Studies, which trains ISL teachers and interpreters, owes a huge amount to his vision and persistence. At European level, David has worked closely with the Council of Europe, and his influence can be seen in the ubiquitous Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, the CEFR. More recently, he has been academic coordinator of the Council's Romani plurilingual policy experimentation. Even when he retired 18 years ago, it would have been hard to sum up his career, and if anything, he seems to have become even more active since then. David has been an inspirational academic leader and a tremendously supportive colleague and friend over many years, to me and to many others. I'll now leave it to Professor Lorna Carson, former head of our school, and like me, a former PhD student of David's, and to David himself to explore his ideas in more depth. I'm very much looking forward to the conversation. I'm sure you are too. And I'll hand over to Lorna and David.
Thank you, Breffni. Good morning, everybody. So, David, I'm going to ask you 5 questions this morning. And the first one is a little bit of history. How did CLCS come about?
Well, almost by accident, I think. Before I came to Trinity, I spent a year at the Auslands- und Dolmetscherinstitut of the University of Mainz in Germersheim, which was an extraordinary backwater with wonderful stories to tell, which I won't do now. But I was involved in training interpreters, and that meant that I learned how to drive a language laboratory. And that somehow came out when I was interviewed for the junior lectureship in German, which brought me here in January 1967. And almost as I stepped off the plane, my head of department, Lionel Thomas, said to me, "You know about language laboratories?" And I said, "Well, a little." The college had been a bit blindsided in, I think, about 1964 or 5, but Corinna would know the correct date, perhaps, when Pi Electronics, who were manufacturers of language laboratories. They had a factory in Dundrum, but they were on the edge of going out of business, and for publicity's sake, free advertisement, they gave Trinity a language laboratory, which was installed in West Chapel on the first floor. And of course, no one really knew what language laboratories were or what should happen to them and so on. And it was given into the charge of the head of the Russian department, Winifred McBride. And there was a subcommittee of the School of Modern Languages, school committee, and the news that Lionel had for me when I arrived in 1967 was, "You'll be glad to know you're the department's representative on the Language Laboratory Subcommittee." So that drew me into that area. And there were representatives on that committee from French, myself from German, Irish, Italian, and Spanish. I can even remember who the members of the committee were. Hugh Shields for French, Clotilde Beau for Italian, Terence McCaughey for Irish, and Ken Adams for Spanish. Nothing much happened until I was one lunchtime told, at 5 o'clock this afternoon, we've a meeting of the Language Laboratory Subcommittee in the Russian department. So I turned up at 5 o'clock, and the other members of the committee turned up. And then Winifred talked to us. It seemed endlessly. And then we went away. And there wasn't an agenda, and there wasn't really anything to talk about, because I'm not sure that any of the members of the committee actually used the language lab on a regular basis. Oh, Ken Adams did, I think. And this went on and on, term by term, for several years, until the members of the subcommittee decided it was time for a coup. We needed to draw some kind of discipline into our discussions. And they got their heads together and decided they were going to give Winifred an ultimatum. In the future, we would have agendas, which would be circulated in advance. And we would also have minutes. And this was put to her very firmly. And with a political agility that I don't think any of them imagined she possessed, she said, "Well, people," she used to talk to us like that, people. "Well, people, I'm the world's worst chairman, and I'm certainly not going to write minutes. Elect a chairman secretary from among your number. That's the way to resolve this problem." They were completely, I don't know that I knew the word in those days, but gobsmacked. And they elected the only person who wasn't there, and that was me. Because the only time in my life I was in bed with flu. I missed a whole 2 weeks of lecture term. And when I came back to college, almost the first person I saw was Ken Adams, who greeted me with a roguish grin and said, "Congratulations." I wondered what he was congratulating me on. "Well, my elevation to be chair of the Language Laboratory Subcommittee." Soon after that, college began to make serious plans for this building, and that had implications for language laboratories. I was naive enough in those days to think that we would take the old language laboratories from West Chapel and put them in here, and I was very surprised to learn that everything would be new. And about that time too, the HEA invited the universities to submit special academic development projects. The idea was to avoid duplication of academic specializations across the system, so that if such and such a thing happened in Trinity, it wouldn't happen elsewhere, but on the other hand, Cork and Galway and whatnot could do other things. That was the idea. And Martino Murahu, recently deceased, was dean of our faculty. And he said, "Why don't we put one of these things in association with what we want to do in the arts building?" So we did. And to the rage of some of our science departments, the HEA bought it. So what we got was the notion of a development that would be built on the technical installations, language labs in those days essentially, but it was going to have an academic dimension. During my time in German already, I got to know John Trim, who was the director or head of the linguistics department at the University of Cambridge. And he was someone who had, on the basis of a linguistics department, developed self-access language learning in language laboratories and so on, and with a library of a very large number of languages serving the whole university. And he was also at that time promoting the idea of the self-instructional language laboratory. So we invited John Trim to advise us on how we should go about turning this project approval into some kind of reality. And he came over several times and discussed things with myself and colleagues in the modern language departments and so on and so forth. But essentially his message was, if you set up a language center as a source of service teaching and you don't embed it in a normal academic department or whatever, with the usual obligations for research, you run the risk that whatever is happening in the way of language learning and teaching in your language center will fossilize. He, as I said a couple of minutes ago, had started with the Department of Linguistics in Cambridge and then added language teaching and language learning especially to what they did. It was our way to do these things in reverse order. So to begin with, we set up the installations on the basis of that, we made our recruitments. We also had allowance for technical staff, so we recruited academic and technical staff, and things went on from there. Have I run out of time on this one? I was seconded from the German department for 2 years to get this development set up technically, organizing a phonetics lab and language laboratories and so on, and gradually sorting out appropriate organizational administrative structures. But it wasn't part of my life plan at that time to apply for the post of directing the center when it came up. For the very simple and good reason that I didn't consider I was qualified. I didn't know anything about linguistics. I didn't know anything really about language learning, and I didn't know very much about language teaching, apart from the tradition that I'd been educated through, starting in a grammar school in Surrey in 1953. So the post was advertised. I didn't apply. To my embarrassment, I was made to sit on the nominating committee and to sit in on the interviews. 8 people were interviewed in one day in the boardroom, I seem to remember. And they were from an enormous range of disciplines, pseudo-disciplines, experience, aspiration, and so on. But although we'd provided a good briefing, they didn't persuade the external assessors, John Trim, and the head of communication studies in Liverpool University, Geoffrey Latham. They weren't persuaded that any of these people had the kind of understanding that would realize the vision that we'd been gradually developing. And then they tried headhunting. And various people were brought to Dublin and ran away almost as quickly as they arrived. So in the end, I think Geoffrey Latham said to John Trim, why don't, this fellow Little seems to know what he's doing, why don't they ask him? So they did. and they said, you may want time to think. So I said yes, and went home and asked the boss, and then said yes. And that was, of course, a major change. I was, because of the kind of ethos that we were trying to cultivate, I had myself to start being seriously interested in research in an area that I knew absolutely nothing about. And I'm eternally grateful to David Singleton, who was one of the first academic appointments we made, who led me by the hand through the early stages of my becoming not really an applied linguist, but something on the way to that. And I think, too, it's important for me to say that college was extraordinarily fortunate, so was I, to be able to recruit in that very first phase colleagues who, all of them, turned out to develop significant international research reputations. Alvin Cassidy was the first person to come. She came in October 79, which was when I started officially as director. David Singleton, the following January. Soon after, then we ran into, this was the early 80s, of course, so we ran into financial problems and there was a hiatus. After another year or two, we were able to appoint a lecturer in linguistics, and that was Rose McLaren, but she came from the north of Ireland, and when she married, she wished not to stay here. But then John Side came, and shortly after that, Krista Goebel. And during all this time, Jeff Callan, though not in CLCS, was a close associate. So that was an extraordinarily powerful base for developing the kind of research profile that we did develop. To an extent that I don't think the college ever really fully understood over the following 20, 25, 30 years. I think that's my answer to that question.
Well, I think we speak on behalf of colleagues and for all your former students. We're very glad that that college agreed that you had the chops to lead it, David, because this room would be absolutely empty without you. So thank you, and thanks to John Tribban. And Latham's first name?
Jeffrey Latham.
Jeffrey Latham. So, yeah, we're personally very invested in that decision, looking back. So, you've kind of touched on this already, but when and how then did learner autonomy enter your life? What was the transition over to learner autonomy as a subject of interest?
Well, there was a false dawn, because in 1979, the Council of Europe published what in language education is thought to be the foundational study by Henri Olek, who was director of the CRAPEL, le Centre de Recherche et d'Application Pédagogique en Langue at the University of Nancy, the title of which in English is Autonomy and Foreign Language Learning. And I was an early reader of that because John Trim was, besides heading the linguistics department in Cambridge, also the advisor to the modern languages projects of the Council of Europe. So I used to get the various publications from him as they came out, and that included Olek's study. And I also had a lot of planning contact with a colleague of John's in Cambridge, Edith Esch, who had been in Olek's setup and had come to Cambridge to set up this sort of self-instructional resource for language learning. So that was where autonomy was, and that it was in that context that I first heard someone say autonomy, and I thought, well, better find out about that. And when we were setting out to establish a self-access support for language learning here in college, that was what I thought it was all about. I mean, essentially, it was learning without a teacher. It was students sitting in a language laboratory booth with headset on, with tapes and printed material, usually working their way through materials that would be designed for class teaching anyway. But that was how it was. I did try one or two small-scale projects outside the sort of modern languages framework. And one, we had a self-instructional program for engineering students that ran for several years and did quite well, using something called the BBC German kit. But that was still, for me, very much at arm's length. But in 1980, Delma O'Callaghan organised a big conference on foreign languages in the school system, essentially. And the idea was that it was time that Ireland caught up and so on and so forth. And out of that conference, a group of language teachers from second and third levels, self-selecting, came together to form what became known as the ITE Modern Languages Project. ITE, long defunct, Institute Teangailteachta Éireann, the Linguistics Institute of Ireland. And they had one post that was devoted to modern languages, not Irish. And we used to meet this group of second and third level teachers every Wednesday evening. And we did that for several years. And when we'd done some preliminary work towards proposals for a sort of functional, notional type syllabus to frame modern language teaching in the schools, that got nowhere. The different language groups started developing materials. And of course, there were more teachers of French than of anything else in this group. And they produced a 3-year program, 3 textbooks for first, second, and third year, leading up to what was then the intermediate certificate, now junior certificate. It was published by the Education Company, and it was a bestseller. And the question was, who gets the royalties? And the director of ITE said, we do. 200,000 punt was the royalty generated by that course when it was first published. Almost every child beginning French in schools in Ireland was using it, including our second daughter, who rebelled against French because at the beginning it said, at the end of this unit, you will be able to do. And it said it in French. And the teacher said to them, now, that's what you've got to remember. And if you can't do that, you'll be in detention. So our daughter Hilary realized then that language teaching wasn't a very good thing. But the point is that we had all this money, or ITE had all this money, and we negotiated that they would use some of it to bring international experts from outside Ireland to have weekend seminars with us and explain how we could become better at our jobs, which was mostly language teaching. And a lot of them came, and they had big names attached to them, but I have to tell you that I didn't get much out of listening to most of them. But then this woman came with a sort of maniacal glint in her eye from Denmark. And she was already making a name for herself as someone who'd successfully operationalized this notion of autonomy in language learning in her classroom. She was a teacher of English in a Danish middle school, but also working in the local authorities in service work. And that was Leni Dunn. And she talked to us about what she did and how she did it, largely by showing us the logbooks that her learners kept while they were learning, just ordinary exercise books. And she had some very murky videos. This was in the infancy of video technology of an affordable kind. And I remember when we were preparing for her visit, she'd said she'd bring these videos, and it was extraordinarily difficult, first of all, to work out from her description which standard it was, because there were umpteen different standards. Anyway, finally, we managed somehow or other to get playback facilities. And she showed us these videos. It was a bit like peering through the murk on a foggy November evening to see what was going on in them. But it was very, very clear that there was something quite unusual here. I mean, these were young teenagers who were working autonomously, not in the sense that they were working on their own, but in the sense that they were fully responsible for what they were doing. They were taking all the decisions, of course, under the guidance of the teacher. And the whole time they were doing this in English. I mean, these were kids of 12, 13, 14, having conversations in English as a way of managing their learning, but also doing their learning. And I mean, I could barely believe it, because I knew that wasn't the kind of thing that was happening in language classes in our schools, and it certainly hadn't happened to me when I was at school. So that for me was a Damascene moment. I realized that this woman had the secret, and it was going to be necessary to find out more about that. And that set me on, to begin with, a lot of reading. There was a lot of reading to do, most of it not in linguistics or applied linguistics, of course, but in psychology and pedagogy. But I stayed in contact with Leonie and got to know the work of her learners very well, and began to participate. There was a network called the Nordic Learner Autonomy Network. They used to meet every year for workshops in the Nordic countries, and I got to know the other people there. Of course, I wasn't at that stage in any way a practitioner, not even at arm's length. But I found that I was suddenly writing a lot on the basis of thinking quite a lot and publishing a lot. And so I suppose by the end of the 80s into the 90s, learner autonomy had become what I thought I was about. And it then shaped everything that I have done subsequently. I mean, I tried to, with appropriate adaptation, make sure that the teaching I did in RM Phil courses corresponded in general terms to this concept. But when we set up the language modules here in Trinity in 1993, we put a great deal of emphasis on doing it all through the target language, whatever that happened to be. And we also made it a requirement that the students learned by doing project work, and they chose their own projects and they prepared them. And at the end of each term, there would be a sort of project fair and a series of performances and so on. And then later on, when we set up the School for Adult Refugees, Integrate Island Language and Training, again, there was a very strong emphasis on the importance of engaging the learners, learner agency. One of the basic principles was that none of our students should leave a 4-hour session in IILT not being able to do a bit more in their lives outside, which were being lived partly through English, than they could when they came in the morning. And then we were encouraging the same kind of thing, Barbara Simpson and I, when, as an add-on to Integrate Island Language and Training, we were doing for 7 or 8 years the regular in-service for teachers of English as an additional language in the primary and post-primary schools. And I learned a great deal more then about what can happen more or less by accident if you develop an approach to education, as Deirdre Kerwin did with her colleagues in Scoil Rita Calini out in Blanchardstown, I mean, she had 320 girls, 50 home languages, and 80% of the girls didn't speak English at home. What do you do there? Well, the first thing is you recognize that the home language they've got is absolutely fundamental. It's their identity, it's who they are, it's their default medium, not only of communication, but discursive reflection. So you let them use it. You encourage them to use their language, not just in the schoolyard, but in the classroom. That's where learner autonomy comes in. How do teachers cope when they don't know what these kids are saying? You trust the kids. And of course, they rewarded that trust. And that actually put a whole new light for me on this notion of learner autonomy and the kind of things that Leni was doing that I began to learn a great deal about in the 1990s was saying we want to develop an autonomy-oriented, agentic approach to learning, which means that we've got to completely revolutionize the way we think of teaching. But we're doing that to get them proficient in a language other than their mother tongue. But what Deirdre and her colleagues were doing was saying, these kids have got energy and agency that they can only express and access through their home language. So what we have to do is to take that as the source of agency, autonomy, draw it into the center of the education process by encouraging them to use it. And then all will be well. When Deirdre got in touch with me in 2012 because some of the teachers wanted to look into issues of learner self-assessment, and she knew that I thought I knew a bit about that. And I went over to the school to talk to the teachers one afternoon at the end of school, and they were still dealing with the last kids and parents who wanted to talk about this or that. So we went into Deirdre's office and she showed me some of the work that these pupils were doing. And among it was what looked to me like age-appropriate writing in their home languages. And I'd never imagined that this could happen. But what was happening here, you see, was that these kids had got the home language between their ears. They got that kind of competence. They were learning to read and write from the very early stages in English, and in Skolvrija, that was almost immediately transferred to Irish. And it was carried through in 5th and 6th classes to French. And from about 3rd class, where they were encouraged to do homework in parallel in English and Irish, the kids from immigrant families started doing it in 3 languages. And so they were developing an age-appropriate literacy autonomously, using the agency that welled out of the energy that came because they were curious young kids, but it came out of their home languages. That's probably all a bit muddled and confusing, but you can see that it grips me.
Thanks, David. I think many of us will have remembered watching Leni Dam's recordings on VHS in this room, and a lot of us will have cited your 1991 Learner Autonomy seminal little volume and many more papers afterwards. So I think there's a lot of nods around the lecture theatre.
Yes, I was involved with Sean Devitt in Authentic, and we had a book series for teachers, and I wanted to get just a very basic message about learner autonomy out there. So I wrote a very short thing, and we published it as a book of 62 pages, I remember, just about that size. When Authentic ceased to exist, I kept getting requests for it from unlikely places like Iran. And so I decided the sensible thing was simply to upload the PDF file to ResearchGate. Well, if I had a euro for every time that's been downloaded, I checked the figures this morning. It's 73,000. Imagine if I had a euro, if I had a cent for that. But anyway, yes.
One of my enduring memories in receiving emails from you is, "Dear Lorna, greetings from Strasbourg." So how did you get involved in the language education work of the Council of Europe?
Well, John Trim has been mentioned several times as external examiner in German, as head of the Linguistics department at Cambridge, and also as the advisor to the modern languages projects in Strasbourg. He channeled the work that they were gradually publishing through the 70s and early 80s to me, because he knew I was interested. And of course, I was on his radar. The Council had very ambitious language education, modern languages focused projects in the 1980s and into the 90s. In the 1980s, year after year, they used to have teacher, educator workshops that were hosted by different member states, by universities or whatever. And the deal, you would have one representative from each member state. So that was already 40-something people who would be coming to this. And the Council of Europe paid their travel. And if you were organizing one of these things, you had to provide them with accommodation and meals. Council of Europe also allowed you to hire a couple of people from outside to share in the workshops. And these were week-long events. You know, people came in on Sunday, started on Monday, finished on Friday, and they went home on Saturday, or Sunday if they had an Apex ticket. So, I got involved in one of those. Most of these things, of course, focused even in those days on English, but they were going to have one on German, and they were racking their brains, do we know anyone who knows any German? And they remembered, or John Trim remembered, that I used to know a bit of German. So I got drawn into this, and it was a very strange event held at Dillingen an der Donau. And then the following year, 87, Sean Devitt and I organized similar workshop here in college, and it coincided with summer commencements because it was 87 that college awarded an honorary Lit D to John Trim. So I was sort of on the fringes of that. And then in the 1990s, the Council of Europe was developing the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, and they were commissioning a number of preliminary studies because the original blue document, if you happen to have read it, you'll know this. It's not just proficiency scales. They're originally a bit of an afterthought. It's a fairly compendious discussion of teaching and learning, perhaps a bit from a biased perspective on assessment, but still. So I was asked if I would write something on strategic competence. So I did, because of course that was learner autonomy, and that was in '96. And then in 1997, they had a big conference in Strasbourg where they launched the penultimate edition or version of the Common European Framework, and also some preliminary proposals for a European language portfolio. And after that conference, the Common European Framework was put into its final form, and there was a pilot project that ran for 3 years to find out how to develop and implement this notion of a European language portfolio. And by then, Barbara Simpson and I, were using the Common European Framework in the first or second version to help us with the work we were doing teaching English to adult refugees, but then also supporting English as an additional language in the school system. And we were also quick into the field with versions of the European language portfolio. So Barbara and I quickly got drawn into these pilot projects. And I mean, one thing led to another. To begin with, I was a consultant to the validation committee. They had this pilot project running, but at the end of the pilot project, they were committed to setting up a scheme for validating and accrediting European language portfolios. So anyone who wanted could develop a portfolio, submit it to Strasbourg, and they would then have a committee that would look at it and decide whether or not it met the criteria. And if it did, it would be given a validation stamp and an accreditation number. And that committee started work in 2000. And to begin with, I was a consultant to the committee. The reason for that was that I couldn't be a representative because I didn't have an Irish passport. So I mean, I still had a UK passport. So so I was sort of supernumerary, but I suppose had rather a lot to say for myself. And then after a couple of years, they had to downsize, so I became a member of the committee. I said to Joe Shields, the Irishman in charge of this in Strasbourg, is that kosher? I said, so that was okay. And then the head of Moscow State Linguistic University, which is where the spies are trained, she was a member of our validation committee, and she sidled up to me in the coffee bar one day and said, "You will be chairman." And I said to her, "No, Irina, I won't," because I actually wanted someone else to be chairman. And she said, "Well, you will." But I said no, and I prevailed. So that particular coup didn't work. But I was then vice chair and in the end chair. And then during the years when the European language portfolio was still a fairly buoyant entity, I coordinated 2 projects of the European Centre for Modern Languages in Graz. That's a partial agreement of the Council of Europe, which means that member states belong or don't belong. If they belong, they have to contribute to the annual budget. And for the ECML, I coordinated 2 4-year projects on the European language portfolio. So, and then because we were using Council of Europe materials in our work on English as an additional language, because we had this framework, English language proficiency benchmarks. That was the Department of Education's name, not mine. And essentially reformulations in a very simple way of levels A1, A2, and B1 for supporting the initial English language support and portfolios. Strasbourg said to me and Barbara Simpson, "We've got to do something for Romani. And we think that maybe something along the lines that you've been doing for EAL in Ireland would be a good idea." So we had a project running there from about, I don't know, 2003-04 till 2008, where we had a group of Roma and Romani language consultants from different countries working with us. And what effectively we did was to recast what we'd done for English as an additional language in the primary schools for teaching and learning Romani around the edges of the school systems in Central Europe, with accompanying passports that Barbara designed and so on. And that was rolled out at a conference in Strasbourg. And then the European Centre for Modern Languages got funding from the European Commission to take this work as the basis for developing teaching and learning materials in 7 or perhaps 8 different varieties of Romani. And that happened between 2010 and 2013. I was only peripherally involved there, except when it came to the evaluation. Barbara Simpson and I wrote the evaluation report. And on the basis of that, the ECML decided to establish a training and consultancy, which is what they do to exploit their projects into the future. And I coordinated that until last year. So that sort of went on for something like 20 years. And in parallel with that, in 2006, the Council of Europe was getting worried at the way in which member states were beginning to show signs of using the proficiency levels of the Common European Framework as a gatekeeping device with migrants. In other words, language tests if you don't get this level and so on. And they set up a committee to look into that, to write advisory papers and so on and so forth. And of course, because the experience I had with Integrate Ireland Language and Training, because I was unpaid director of that, and all the other work that Barbara and I have been doing with the schools, it seemed to them obvious that I would be involved in that, which I was until 2017. And gradually through that time, from 2006 to 2017, more and more member states introduced usually very dodgy assessments that people had to pass in order to get residency or permanent residency or citizenship or whatever. And it was completely dishonest and completely crooked and completely immoral. And I'm glad to say, and I'm actually proud to say, that Ireland is one of only 2 countries among all the member states of the Council of Europe that still doesn't have language tests for migrants. And long may that last. The other country is Sweden, and a friend of mine is currently working on the first language tests for migrants in Sweden. So we're going to be soon on our, I think San Marino doesn't have tests either, but soon we'll be on our own. There was, I'd better not name him because there is, I believe, a plan to make this talk available to the wider world. But we did have a Minister of Integration at one time who began talking in very firm terms about needing to have language tests for all these people coming in. He said, after all, there are far too many of these Polish builders haven't got a word of English. And someone said to him, but Minister, Poland's an EU member. If they come here, they've got freedom of movement. We can't make them learn the language. Ah, feck it, he said. So, yes.
I think I remember being in that lecture theatre. David, you have been really involved in migrant language learning, both in Ireland and then more generally in Europe. And you've touched a little bit on that. But how did that happen and develop?
Well, it was another of these things happened by accident, actually. In the middle 1990s, there was an organization called the Refugee Agency, which was a sort of outpost of foreign affairs. And the job of the Refugee Agency was to manage the welfare of refugees admitted to Ireland. And part of that welfare management was providing them with opportunities to learn English, because obviously if they were going to be integrated in Irish society, they needed at least a functional proficiency in the language. And there was an education committee at the Refugee Agency with various people from various walks of life. But they were getting a bit worried because they were spending quite a lot of money sending these refugees to different private language schools, but they never had any evidence that they were making progress, and no one ever seemed to finish. And they wondered whether this was perhaps the best way to spend the Irish taxpayers' money. And they said, well, what we really need is a discussion paper that would talk about the kind of challenges that we're trying to help these refugees to meet, and perhaps how those challenges would best be met. And one member of the committee happened to be the wife of a colleague of mine, not immediately in CLCS, but in another language department. And she knew in general terms of my interest in language learning and teaching. So she said, well, why don't you ask him? If he doesn't want to do it, he'll probably tell you someone who can. So they did ask me, and I did write this discussion paper, 30 pages. But I said how it should be done, you see, and that also then came out of all this autonomy stuff. And they said, well, we think this is very good. We think this is the kind of way we ought to be going. So would you be interested in doing a second part to this, which would be a sort of taking criteria from here and evaluating what it is the language schools are doing? So I agreed to do that, and that was when Barbara Simpson started to work with me. She had been Director of Studies at the Centre for English Studies in Dame Street, but decided she wanted to change, so she came and worked on this. And it was Barbara who did all the legwork, going around these language schools and so on. And then, at the end of our report on that, which wasn't entirely negative, but not hugely positive, we had a set of recommendations. And that was that. And then about 2 years after I thought this was all passed, I had a phone call from someone or other in the Department of Education saying, we want you to do this thing you were talking about. I had to be reminded what it was that I'd said we would do. And so we set up a 2-year project in college called the Refugee Language Support Unit. And that began by getting all the language schools who wanted to be involved in this to re-tender, and we imposed strict requirements on how they should teach and what the progression should be and so on and so forth. At the same time, we were already doing a certain amount of outpost teaching where people were living remotely from language schools in different parts of the country. But within a very short time, all the private language schools had wisely withdrawn. And so we were left running our own language school. And we did it in various places, but we ended up in what had been the veterinary college in Ballsbridge, opposite the American Embassy. And Helen Kelly was one of our distinguished and dedicated teachers there for a number of years. And that then, of course, it quickly became well known. Not just here, but I mean, we had constant streams of visitors from different Council of Europe member states who'd heard me talking about it here, there, or somewhere else. And so we were always having these little delegations from countries who wanted to find out how to do it and do it. So from that very accidental thing, it grew very large. Double ILT was an early casualty of the financial crash in 2008. By that time, our annual budget from the Department of Education was €3 million. We were teaching, and in the summer of 2008, which was when I was preparing for retirement, I had a letter from the Department of Education, just a 2-liner, saying no more money after the end of whatever the month was. They had never been interested in what we did, provided we could account for every cent they gave us. And I spent that summer with Barbara Simpson in and out of the Labour Court, making 53 people redundant. So it wasn't an entirely happy experience. And I know this is going to be recorded, but I will say this. During the 8 years of Integrate Ireland Language and Training's life, we were absolutely die straight on the management of finance and could always produce detailed, properly audited annual accounts. But we also produced annually, Helen will remember this, detailed reports on what we were doing that were administrative in the sense that they were the evidence that supported the expenditure, but they went beyond that. And they were always sent to the Department of Education. But the Department of Education was only ever interested in clean accounts. And I thought at the time that that was a pity. When we were told to close down, we had an enormous database of material. We had various publications. As far as the Department of Education was concerned, they could go in the bin. I've always found that truly shocking and shameful. I had to work very hard to organize the transfer of a lot of these materials, and the NCCA was extremely helpful in providing a home for a lot of them, and the materials we developed, for example, for English as an additional language, are still available on the NCCA website.
David, you mentioned you retired in 2008, which, speech marks retired. Last main question is really to bring us up to speed on what you're working on these days.
Well, I'm still working with the Council of Europe in GARS, the ECML. They have this agreement with the European Commission to address issues in language education that are of concern both to the Council of Europe and the European Union, the European Commission. One of the problems that has been identified is persuading people outside Anglophone Europe to learn languages other than English. And the authorities in many of these countries attribute that to poor learner motivation. I'm sure that's not the truth, but they wanted the ECML to do something on motivation in relation to language learning. And so I was asked to put together a small expert group, and they wanted a motivation manifesto for the European Day of Languages last year. We did that. We had a supplementary sort of fuller document. And now we're working on something this year for language teacher education. And next year, you can see I'm not planning to die anytime soon. Next year, it's something for policy makers. So there's that work. A couple of weeks ago, I finished the second of 2 chapters I'm contributing to a Bloomsbury handbook on world languages education. The editor gave me titles and asked me to write these titles. So the first chapter was on transformative plurilingual learning, and the second one was plurilingual learning in action. So that enabled me to write yet again about Scolvigia Calini and my Romani project. I spent this last few days recording the videos that accompany a book that is coming out towards the end of this month. It's very short, only about 100 pages. But the idea is that the videos provide an introduction, but also a summary to each of the chapters. I found myself doing that for some other project quite by accident, and it seemed to work quite well. So if you get the book, there's a QR code at the beginning of each chapter, and you can get these little mini lectures. So I was doing that. For quite a long time, I've been on the editorial board of language teaching, the Cambridge University Press journal. The editor sometimes, if he's got an idea for a new slot in the journal, he sometimes asks me if I'll try it out. I mean, he wanted one, he's got one now, first person singular, and he asked me to inaugurate that 3 or 4 years ago. The idea is that someone whose name is associated with a particular area in language education writes a personal view of that, and I did that obviously on learner autonomy. The latest stunt he has is old man's rant. He's realized that there are lots of people like me who go on for rather a long time, and he says you must have things you'd like to get off your chest before you know. He invited me to do that, and I have to do that. And there's another article for a handbook, if you please, on learner autonomy. I've agreed to do a chapter on the Common European Framework and learner autonomy. And then Deirdre and I have got a project running with the Laois Education Support Centre on primary Irish, where what we're trying to do is to explore ways, we're working with 10 schools and 20 teachers, and we've had 3 out of 4 one-day seminars with them down in Port Laois. We're trying to work out ways of, in a relatively straightforward way, converting this sort of autonomy pedagogy into something that would be accessible for use in primary schools. I mean, Deirdre's kids in Scoil Regio were completely fluent in Irish. And it's a national scandal that that's not standard practice, standard achievement. So we thought we'd try to do something about it. I have a long list of things here.
I'm going to...
Oh, and yes.
Go ahead.
No, that's all.
I'm going to...
it's not all.
I'm going to wrap up by abusing the chair's position here to say that, David, you've been an absolutely marvellous teacher, and you have touched the lives of hundreds of thousands of teachers around the world. For me, you were an early geography teacher, where I received one of those emails that said, "Dear Lorna, greetings from Buenos Aires." And I wrote back with my little missive from my PhD. So, "Dear David, dear Professor Little, I've done A, B, and C. Enjoy Brazil." And then I just got a one-liner. "Dear Lorna, Buenos Aires is in Argentina. Best, David."
Yes.
So I've learned many things. Many of your PhD students are in the room, and our favourite email that we used to receive was dear Liz, dear Lorna, dear Deirdre, when we sent our chapters, "Safely received. Best wishes, David." You did that every single time. And I think looking around the room at members of CLCS and other organisations, we were in awe of your current and continued ability to respond to every email. Your enormous writing discipline and productivity. Your administrative skills are extraordinary. But on writing, one tip in closing for us in the room who labour at our writing, what would you share as we struggle in academic writing and trying to communicate our passion to a wider audience? What's your hot old man tip in writing?
There's no such thing as writer's block. You just have to keep doing it, and you have to be doing it pretty well every day. And sometimes it flows, and sometimes it doesn't. I was doing one of these kind of things online with a PhD student in Japan a couple of months ago, and she was saying, that she admired the clarity of my writing. Well, I said, sometimes it takes 2 or 3 days to get a paragraph right, but you have to keep at it. One of the really important things about this learner autonomy approach, and I do it full justice for the first time in this about to appear book, is the importance of writing. Writing is as important as speaking. And these kids in Leonie Dumm's classes were writing in logbooks in real time. They were recording their learning. They were writing down new words as they came, and she was writing things for them on posters, bits of flip chart paper stuck to the classroom wall that they could copy down. They were constantly getting the language in writing as well as in speech, and constantly processing it in both channels. And that is what, more than anything else, was responsible for the very high levels of proficiency that they achieved relatively early. It was also what was responsible for the very high levels of home language literacy that Deirdre's pupils got to, because they did that through writing, and endless writing. So you have to keep at it. And never, ever, if you're a PhD student, you should start writing the day before you register. That was something that I think I was always quite firm with my PhD students about. You need to start writing at a very early stage. I didn't. As a postgraduate student in Oxford, I got very little in the way of supervision, and I couldn't even access the word. And I wasn't always, I read an enormous amount and I made an enormous number of notes, but writing wasn't something that I did early in the process, and I should have done. And so I learned that lesson.
Thank you, David. That brings us to the end of the set piece, but we've got 2 roving mics in the room, and I expect there will be other questions from the floor. But for those of you who might want to slip out at this stage, we've got 10 minutes of Q&A, but I'll just thank David at this stage for such a wonderful contribution. Thank you. Yes.
Hi, my name is Wan Lin, and I have a background in applied linguistics, and now I'm teaching Mandarin Chinese for T1 and the Living Cert in Ireland. And I would like to ask a question about, for example, with my background, I cross research and also teacher in the classroom. What is the most effective way for me to identify the gaps between the policy and the school, for example, teachers and the students, and make a contribution to the ecosystem of the policy, research, and the school about the language education in Ireland. Thank you.
Goodness. I don't know that I know the answer to that question. I think a policy, of course, operates at different levels. And we, of course, have national policies, but we also should have school-level policies. How you get into the questioning, discussion, change of school policy will depend very much on the school that you're teaching in and the principle and the general way in which the school operates. Deirdre's the person you should probably be asking about that rather than me. One of the things about teacher research in the classroom that has struck me is that the problem with action research is that it is predicated on the assumption that there will always be something wrong that you need to correct. Well, that's not necessarily going to be the case. And then, 20 odd years ago, Dick Allwright came up with this notion of, what do they call it? Exploratory practice, which is an alternative to action research, but involves learners and is exploratory practice. The idea is that you do the research as you practice. But whenever one reads accounts of exploratory practice, it seems obvious that whoever is conducting the research has thought of something and they get off the regular teaching learning wagon for a couple of weeks and do something and collect data and write it up and then get back to teaching. But that's unlikely to have a lasting impact on anything. But in the approach that I've been describing in necessarily rather general terms, if you work with learner logbooks, you've got data that is constantly developing under your hands. And it should be very easy then to analyze that data in a multitude of ways. I mean, over the last 30 years, Leonard has published God knows how many articles looking at these logbooks from different angles. But the point is that one knows that the logbooks are evidence of learning as it's actually happening, and as it's also resulting in proficiency in the language that's being learned. And the great thing about committing myself to the idea of learner autonomy was that I wasn't ever talking in aspirational terms. I mean, I wanted my own learning environments to be like Leonard, but I knew that what she did worked. I mean, the evidence is absolutely incontrovertible. And that's, there's been plenty of other evidence that it works in projects I've been involved in since.
Yeah, right at the back.
Hi, I'm Veronica, a primary education student from Slovenia, and I can see that language learning is often strongly connected with testing, and my question is, how can teachers encourage learner autonomy while still preparing formal assessments?
I didn't get that.
So how can teachers help learners develop autonomy when preparing for assessment? To focus on testing.
Well, the smart answer to that is that in about 2 weeks, if you go to the Candlin and Maynard website, if you've got €10, you'll be able to get 100 pages on all of that kind of stuff. That's this new book that I am talking about. It's called Language Learner Autonomy, A Practical Guide. This is the one that has the videos attached. And that does talk about the kind of thing you've just asked a question about.
And that's the Candlin and Maynard website, publishers.
Yes, Candlin and Maynard, all one word. Maynard, M-Y-N-A-R-D.
And I think one final question. Oh, 2 more, 3 more. Yeah, right. We start with the black. Okay.
David, I just wanted to ask you something a bit from my perspective. How do you deal with the inherent tension that will be in Ireland between teaching people standard English and the type of English they're going to be exposed to if they walk out the streets of Dublin or in Cork or Galway anywhere? As you've got a discrepancy between standard English in their books and then what people would hear in the vernacular mode around the country, not just in Dublin.
When we were teaching adult refugees, we didn't use textbooks, course books at all. Everything was based on authentic materials, and the materials that they were learning from were the forms they had to fill in, the leaflets that would come telling them about their entitlements and all that kind of thing. And we also put a lot of effort into community relations so that they were constantly exposed to a range of Irish accents and registers. So that was how we did it, and I mean the idea of standard English wasn't on the horizon really, except when I opened my mouth myself.
And 2 from the front here. So Monday, first of all.
So thank you so much, Debbie. My name's Mengli. Firstly, I just had a comment, very quick comment. So I had a privilege for teaching applied linguistics module in SLC as this semester, and my student, when I introduced the topic of learner autonomy, they love that, and they start to think about, their past language learning experience and how they can, do that in their future learning. So yeah, so it's a wonderful idea, and they keep looking at your work and other colleagues' work as well. So that's my comment. And my question is actually related to your recent work you mentioned. You said that you currently working on like motivation and teacher education as well as language policy. So recently I have been involved in a research project. We try to investigate, different factors influencing third level students in Ireland who whether they learn the continue to learn the language in the university or stopped, because according to the figure, there are around 78% students studying a foreign language in the secondary school level. However, when they came to the university, the number declined sharply, only about 4%. So we there are many other colleagues working on the same funding call. So we are looking forward to analyzing the data and let the data tell us the story. But I just wonder, from your experience and observations, can you share some thoughts? What kind of factors behind this phenomenon, and your comments on that, and how would that contribute to further maybe language policy development in the future? Yeah, thank you.
Yes, the drop from secondary to tertiary.
This afternoon, I think, as part of the preliminaries, I have to give an answer on video to certain questions that have been sent me. And one of them has to do with STEM and health sciences being thought more important or more useful than languages and the humanities. My answer to that is that to lump languages together with health sciences and STEM and the other humanities is actually like comparing apples with oranges. And the fact that we do that, and it's not just here, but worldwide, it shows a very great weakness in educational thinking. The European Union for a long time has had this notion that citizens should be educated in such a way that they have their mother tongue plus 2 other languages. But what the Commission thought it was wanting people to commit to was actually being proficient in those languages. Now, around the world, language teaching in schools far too seldom eventuates in the kind of proficiency that Skolregia, for example, was routinely getting in Irish and French with primary pupils, and that Leni Dam was getting with her learners of English in Denmark. If you could organize the language part of education such that people really did get that proficiency, then you could bring the language and the plurilingual competencies they were developing into whatever they were choosing to study academically beside that. And you would hope that more people would be studying here, would be studying health sciences or STEM subjects or other humanities, drawing on their competence proficiency in a language other than English or Irish, and French or German or Italian or whatever. But that would require a radical rethink of the organization of the whole of education. It would require an approach to the reconstruction of curricula that would never survive first contact with the teachers' unions, and it therefore won't happen. But it could.
And it might. I'm ever the optimist. One last question from the front row. This microphone.
I didn't quite get your argument why the framework is not suitable in the refugee area. It's highly used in Germany, and I think it's problematic. But you said something along that line, and I didn't quite get your argument around
The
it.
Common European Framework.
Sorry?
The
Yeah.
and
I thought you said it's not wise to use the framework, the language framework, in the refugee area.
no. What I was. How can I say this in about 3 sentences? We used the levels of the framework to guide the teaching of adult refugees and to support the English language learning of children from immigrant families. It was a matter of looking at the kind of things they needed to be able to do at each level and how that proficiency gradually progressed over time. It was extremely useful for that purpose. Brona did her PhD showing how useful that could be with school children. What I was talking about in relation to the misuse of the CFR was the identification of a proficiency level, B1. You need B1 for citizenship, that kind of thing. Because, and the reason I'm opposed to that, the people who make those decisions don't begin to have an understanding of what that means, what it means to have B1. And they don't have any idea of the kind of learning provision you'd need to make to get people, especially if they're, they've got low educational levels and so on. So it was that I was being critical of.
Thank you. My responsibility now is to try to whisk David off for lunch. But first of all, I know that you're going to join me in a hearty round of applause. David, thank you for sharing really the secrets of eternal academic youth with us today, and for all the stories, which we've now committed to a podcast. Thank you again. And thanks to each and every one of you for joining us, and especially to our 2 ISL interpreters, Kristina and Cormac, for facilitating today's presentation. So thank you to everyone and to Breffni as well.
Thank you for your time.